Welcome to today's Explainer. I am absolutely thrilled you're here. Today, we're diving into something that literally bridges the gap between mind-bending quantum physics and everyday clinical medicine. We're talking about a revolutionary piece of tech called Optical Coherence Tomography, or OCT for short. Basically, we're going to explore exactly how OCT uses light interference to see inside the human eye. It's wild stuff, and it is actively saving people's sight every single day.
So just think about this for a second. How on earth do we see micrometers deep into a living, functioning eye without making a single cut? I mean, it sounds completely like science fiction, doesn't it? But it's actually a real-world medical superpower. Ophthalmologists use it all the time. And today we are unpacking exactly how manipulating the very nature of light makes this seemingly impossible task a total reality.
Okay, so here's our roadmap for this explainer. 1. Seeing inside the eye. 2. The wave nature of light. 3. What is coherence? 4. How OCT uses interference. And 5. Diagnosing disease with light. Let's just jump right in.
Section 1. Seeing inside the eye.
At its absolute core, OCT relies on something called interferometry to create in vivo cross-sectional maps of the retina. The best way to think about it, it's kind of like a medical ultrasound, but instead of bouncing sound waves off your internal organs, OCT uses light waves to visualize these incredibly microscopic layers of tissue inside a living eye. And because we're using light, there are absolutely zero incisions. But here's the catch. Light travels ridiculously fast, right? So we can't just set a timer to see how long it takes to bounce back like we do with sound. We have to use a totally different trick. Which brings us to the physics of it all.
That brings us to Section 2, the wave nature of light.
Now, as you might remember from science class, light famously has this weird wave-particle duality. The particle model tells us that light is made up of these discrete little energy packets called photons, which, is super helpful if you're looking at things like absorption. But for OCT, we really need to lean heavily into the wave model. This model treats light as an electromagnetic wave that has a specific phase and frequency. It's this wavy behavior that lets us wrap our heads around concepts like interference, diffraction, and coherence. So for OCT to build its incredible images, the wave model is exactly the lens we need to look through.
And honestly, the absolute most crucial wave property we've got to grasp here is interference. This is what happens when two light waves overlap and interact with each other. If the peaks of those waves line up perfectly, they reinforce each other. That's constructive interference. But if a peak lines up perfectly with a trough, they actually cancel each other out, which is destructive interference. Just picture throwing two stones into a perfectly still pond, right? You watch those overlapping ripples interact. That cool geometric pattern of peaks and flat spots, that is interference. But here's the thing. With light, to get a stable pattern we can actually measure, we need a very specific secret ingredient.
And that takes us to Section 3, what is coherence?
So that absolute secret ingredient I mentioned, it's coherence. Basically, coherence is the ability of two light waves to maintain a super predictable phase relationship. Think back to those pond ripples for a sec. If the waves were just totally erratic, constantly shifting their timing around, any interference pattern they made would just be a messy, chaotic blur. Without a predictable, steady relationship between those overlapping waves, the interference pattern is just noise. We absolutely need stability to make this work.
To really get this, let's compare everyday natural light to a laser. Most light, like sunlight or a regular old incandescent light bulb, produces what we call thermal light. It is chaotic. It's made up of a bunch of different wavelengths just emitting independently, with random intensities and totally unrelated phases. Laser light, on the other hand, is fundamentally different. It is highly ordered, very directional, and highly coherent. Its internal electromagnetic field is much more like a smooth, continuous wave, which makes it absolutely perfect for generating those stable interference patterns we need.
Now, coherence actually comes in two distinct flavors, and knowing the difference is super important for OCT. First, there's spatial coherence. This refers to the phase relationship across the actual width of the beam. A spatially coherent beam basically oscillates together across its whole profile, which lets us focus it incredibly tightly. Temporal coherence, though, that's about how well the phase relationship is maintained over time, or basically along the length of the beam as it travels forward. And here is a super crucial detail. Temporal coherence is tied closely to the spectral bandwidth of the light. As we're going to see in a minute, temporal coherence is what dictates exactly how well we can pinpoint depth in our medical images.
Moving right along to Section 4, how OCT uses interference.
So the actual OCT machine operates as something called an interferometer. Imagine the journey of a single photon entering the system. Step 1, The main light beam from the source is physically divided into two separate paths. Step 2. One of those paths travels straight toward the patient's eye tissue, while the other path goes toward a highly controlled reference mirror tucked away inside the machine. Step 3. The light that bounces back from the eye and the light that bounces back from the mirror are brought back together. They recombine, and when they do, they overlap and interfere with each other. But, and this is a huge but, that interference only happens if the optical path lengths of those two separate journeys match up perfectly.
Now there's a really brilliant quote from our source material that highlights a fascinating paradox in how this is designed. It says, "The apparent paradox is useful. High spatial organization supports precise interference. Limited temporal coherence improves axial localization." What in the world does that actually mean? Well, usually, when we think of using lasers in medicine, we picture these highly coherent single wavelength beams. But OCT, it intentionally uses a broad spectrum of wavelengths. By doing that, it purposefully creates low temporal coherence. In other words, a very short coherence length.
And guys, this is the massive aha moment of the whole technology. Low temporal coherence means these waves are only predictable over a very, very tiny distance. Because of that, when the light from the eye and the light from the mirror recombine, they are only going to interfere if their path lengths match perfectly. And I mean perfectly, down to the literal micrometer. That intentionally short coherence length acts like an impossibly precise optical ruler. It guarantees that the interference signal we're measuring is coming from one incredibly specific microscopic depth slice of the retina and literally nowhere else. It is exactly how the machine can tell apart biological structures that are lying just micrometers away from each other.
Just for a bit of context, historically, older systems used what's called time-domain OCT. To make that work, the machine actually had to physically, mechanically move the reference mirror back and forth to find that exact matching depth for every single microscopic point. I mean, it worked, but it was incredibly slow. Today, though, we use spectral domain OCT. In these modern setups, that reference mirror just stays perfectly still. Instead, the returning, combined light gets separated out by its wavelengths, kind of like shining light through a prism. Then, some absolutely mind-bending complex math reconstructs all that depth information instantly. This lets doctors do much faster, super dense scanning, creating these amazing 3D reconstructions with virtually zero motion blur from the patient.
Which brings us to our final section, Section 5, Diagnosing Disease with Light.
By measuring these incredibly tiny light wave interference patterns, doctors can now actually see precise pathologies that used to be completely invisible in a living patient. Because the depth resolution, the axial resolution is just so incredibly fine, clinicians can clearly distinguish the individual layers of the retina itself. They can spot these tiny little pockets of fluid, either intraretinal or subretinal. They can easily diagnose macular holes, or even detect the super subtle thinning of the retinal nerve fiber layer, which is a massive indicator for early glaucoma damage. So, understanding spatial and temporal coherence, it's clearly not just some dry academic exercise. It is actively, right now, preventing blindness.
Oh, and there is this absolutely incredible bonus application to all this called OCT angiography. By taking repeated, ridiculously fast OCT scans at the exact same location in the eye, the machine can actually detect motion contrast. The static still tissue in the eye stays the same, but the moving blood cells flowing inside the vessels, they create a tiny but detectable difference in that interference pattern over time. This means doctors can literally map out the entire vascular network of the retina just by detecting blood flow. No need to inject any intravenous fluorescent dyes into the patient at all. It's so much safer, it's cleaner, and the level of detail is just unbelievable.
So, I'll leave you with this final, kind of mind-blowing thought. Whoever knew that harnessing the weird paradox of quantum wave interaction would turn out to be the ultimate tool for saving human vision? Just by understanding that light acts as a wave, that coherence gives us stability, and that a really short coherence length can create a microscopic measuring stick, well, we've managed to forge one of the most beautiful and life-changing partnerships between fundamental physics and clinical medicine. It's just brilliant. Thanks so much for hanging out with me for this explainer. Keep wondering, keep learning, and I'll catch you in the next one.